Hello, everyone. For me, it's good morning. I don't know what time it will be for you when you listen to this. It's a beautiful day. The snow is all around with a little bit of fresh covering, but all the birds are coming back and the goldfinches are feeding at the bird feeder. So spring is close, a month away, of course, really, or even 2 months, but it's nice to hope. I trust you're all well. I will, as usual, start off with the Sermon on the Mount, but for those of you who may be first-timers, my name is John Patrick. I'm a retired professor, strangely, of biochemistry and pediatrics, and my real interest should have put me elsewhere in some ways, but not in others. I left the university a year or two early because students had changed my life, basically dragging me out of my ivory tower, because if you're made to be a professor, giving undergraduate lectures can be done with ease, and as long as you're funded, the dean won't make you do anything you don't want to do. So it really is an incredibly good life. And tenure, which really ought to be removed, but won't be because of politics, makes you totally comfortable. And I didn't really bother about the students at all. And then throwaway remarks changed all that. And for that, I'm extremely grateful, because what came out of it changed my life for the good and gave me a third career, talking about ethics, culture, faith, and public policy. And this podcast is the latest iteration, really, in this career. Primarily, I'm an oral communicator. That's what I do best. So a podcast is actually a very good idea. I didn't think so, but Craig, who does all the nitty-gritty for this, he set it up and makes sure that it happens. So I hope you enjoy it. At some point, I must find out how much this is costing Craig. I'm sure it's costing him something, but he hasn't asked me for money. But such is the Christian world. And especially in America, the most generous Christian world I know. So, what am I going to talk about today? Well, first of all, I'm going to start, as usual, with the next bit of the Sermon on the Mount. A little bit each week seems to be helpful to people, so I will continue to do it. And that will lead to a discussion of trust and its role in society, and then on to chapter 6, as we're at the end of chapter 5 at the moment. Then I want to talk a little bit about two people who spoke at the ARC conference in the last little while, before getting to Tom Sowell. I just splurged on a new copy of Basic Economics, which I never had my own copy before, and I wish I had done. It's a book that I think every serious person who wants to think about what our duties are in relation to the declining politics of our nations around the world, it's a book that would be well worth reading. So I'll try and introduce you to that. And I will end up with Elizabeth Goudge. And I expect a lot of you will be going out to buy the book, but we'll see, or going online to buy the book if you can find it. So, the Sermon on the Mount, more on trust. We have got to the point where we've looked in some detail at the way Christ wants us to turn from mere believers into disciples, which is what the Beatitudes are, to be gone through daily at some point. For me, the last time was around 3 o'clock this morning when I woke up, as I often do at that time of night. Basically, I look upon it as a time when the good Lord says, I haven't heard from you. What's been going on? He knows, of course, but prayer is not my strongest point, and the middle of the night is when it happens. I pray for my family, and I go through the Sermon on the Mount. So that provides an incredibly solid base for everything else, and keeps you at peace, which is perhaps the most important thing about it in many ways, and attempting to be obedient. Now, the Beatitudes lead to the function, which is to be salt and light in the world. That's what disciples are for. That's what Christians are for. Are you being salty? Are people saying, yeah, you're right, we ought to do that, I ought not to do that? That's what we're there for. We've been taught that we should teach others. The bottom line for every Christian listening to this is you don't have anything terribly difficult to do. What you do need to do is to make sure that every day somewhere you take an opportunity that comes your way simply to tell what the Lord has done for you. Why do I believe? Why does it make a difference? Where can I find examples of what you're talking about, etc., etc.? I think my favorite current example of this would be John Lennox, because you see him first and he looks like everybody's favorite uncle or grandfather, affable, very friendly, and then there's this mind like a razor blade that takes the modern world apart and shows you why it's gone wrong without making you feel anything other than awe. You don't get angry or anything else. You just, my goodness, that man knows a lot. And that's the way it should be. I think when John Lennox and James Tour get together, you have an incredible combination. So if you want to see apologetics done well, that's a good place to go. And you can find both of them together on YouTube. So Jesus wants us to tell what he has done. And what has he done? He's changed the way we look at everything. And in particular, the first chapter of the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus, the world's most famous Jew, who looks at the law and says to the Jewish people very gently and indirectly, you got it wrong. You think the law is to make you good. No, it's not. The law is to teach you that you aren't good, that the fall is real, and that you need a savior. That's a hard lesson to take, but it's real. And so what he does in chapter 5 is take several examples, which we've now looked at, most of them, from the law, and then he turns them upside down. So he says, you think you've been told that you mustn't murder, and you say, well, I haven't done that. But then he goes on and says, well, murder is not what I'm really concerned about, because I don't look at your actions, I look at your intentions, your heart, because that's what I want to change. So when you're angry with your brother, you're well on your way to murder, and certainly it is just as bad. And when you dismiss someone you know who's a Christian, who's your brother in me, as though he is of no importance because you look down on him, no, you're turned 180 degrees away from me. Your intentions and your soul needs a shake-up, and that's what I've come for. So he goes through several examples: lust, divorce, promise-keeping, and we get at the end of the chapter to the difficult bit, turn the other cheek. Now, because the bottom line is, unless I'm very, very unusual in the sense of being much worse than most Christians, I fail every day. But I think that's what the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5 is doing. It's not there to make us feel good. It's there to make us see how big the problem is and how wonderful the release is. The Sermon on the Mount cannot be understood properly until after the Passion. But we are after the Passion, and we can see what it does. The wise writers of the prayer book put it this way: O Lord, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Spirit, that we may love and serve you appropriately and well. There's no wasted word there. But we have done what we ought not to have done, and we have failed to do what we ought to have done. And that is every day, as far as I can see. And in fact, Jesus in the parable of the vine says, you've got to learn that your problem is so serious that you can do nothing without me. But with me, everything is possible. Christ in you, the hope of glory. It's not a joke, it's real. And the problem is that we take this incredible story and sort of domesticate it so that it doesn't bother us too much. But turning the other cheek, do any of us do that? I mean, we're a more sophisticated society in some ways, but I don't think it's an accident that Paul puts gossip next to murder in his list of the things that ought to be gone and aren't. Churches are gossip centres, and that ought to be shut down. It ought to be called what it is. It's murdering other people's reputation almost invariably. Shouldn't be done, but it is, and always has been, and until the second coming probably will continue. But at its highest point, the church does better. And it's time for us to do better because the world needs us desperately. So I don't think any of us can imagine a situation where we, given our own character, our own flaws, our own history, could imagine being able to keep the law as Jesus sets it out. But with him, you can see progress. That's the promise. I think it's real. And perhaps one of the most important things is the comfort one realizes when, you get it wrong, but the answer is simple. Ask for the gift of repentance, repent, and carry on. And you live at peace because of that. And most people are not at peace. Anxiety is rife, especially amongst the young. Shouldn't be for us. There's no reason to be anxious. And so you've got to learn how to do that. If you suffer from anxiety, write out most of the last chapter of Philippians by hand and put it on your fridge. And every time you feel anxious, go and read it. It will change your life. So now we move on, because at the end of that chapter, chapter 5, Jesus says, you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, we cannot do that in our own strength, but he doesn't ask us to do things that can't be done. This is where we're headed. I don't know. I don't think it happens in this life. We're promised when we see him, we will be like him. That's a long way off. Or is it? I mean, I was looking at the statistics this week and suddenly realized that something like 98% of the people who were born in the same year that I was born in are now dead. That's an interesting phenomenon, and many of them are wasting away. So far, I'm still functional to a degree, at least. More irascible in some ways than I've been in the past, perhaps, and annoying people, but others enjoy conversation. And certainly one of the best things in my week is the Saturday morning men's reading group that we have at the church, where there is no gossip and real interest in thinking about how we help the world to be a better place. So, on to the next chapter, which is practicing our faith. But before that, just a reversion once again to Robert Fogel, because I realized in talking about him the other week that I had neglected to read Robert Fogel's list of the virtues that are necessary for a society to function. For those of you who are new, Fogel, a Nobel Prize winner from the world's most famous department of economics, a Jew who was a secularist. But towards the end of his life, just after his black Episcopalian wife had died, and it had been a love match, and as he became increasingly aware that he didn't trust the members of his class at the University of Chicago in the way that he used to, the trust levels were dropping. And that was bad news for America. This was around 2000, because he knew that class were going off to very good jobs in Wall Street and in the governments. And they were putting loyalty over truth, which is the ultimate error, and so subtle that we miss it most of the time. So he wrote the book as a result, looking at the history of the States and realizing how dependent it was upon the Puritans and upon the 18th century revival, amongst other things, that America was essentially a Protestant foundation, congregational. It had to be. You couldn't have a hierarchical church at the beginning of America because you couldn't get the land covered was immense. The means of getting across it were very slow. The only way it could work was congregational. It wasn't a theological choice. It was a practical necessity. It was also a gift because it has a lot to do with the can-do approach to the world that Americans have beyond all others. It's fading, but it's still, especially in the rural areas and the smaller cities. I mean, New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco are not America. They're an aberration which hopefully will get its act together at some point or else be destroyed. I don't know. But within the general population, there is an immense amount of goodwill and charity like no other nation. Who's first to turn up at every disaster? Americans, every time. And the rest of us should get off our high horses and admit it. That's the truth. So Fogel starts thinking, what did we get from these guys? And what he realized was that that's where our ideas of virtue came from. It's interesting that one of the most important philosophical texts written in the last 50 years or so is After Virtue by Alistair MacIntyre, where he recognizes that virtue is disappearing, but has nothing like Fogel's approach to what could be done about it. So Fogel gives us a list of 15 things that you want your children to have before they get messed up by the so-called education system. The first one is a sense of purpose. That's basically what's made Jordan Peterson's incredibly successful career happen. The 10 rules for life should be absolutely unnecessary in any traditional Christian family. But the first thing there is you must have purpose in your life. And almost every particularly young man will say, thank you for showing me how to understand that I need purpose and how to begin to find it. How to go out and do something every day. I mean, he's not a Christian when he wrote that book. He's on his way. I think he's very close. He may even be there. That's not for me to judge. But that first step is critical. Life is not an accident. You are here for a purpose. And deep down, we all know that. Given that, you're then looking around for, okay, what is my purpose to be? And at various times in your life, it may change. I was having a long conversation this week with my son, who's an academic, successful, with a lot of talent. But he says, I've reached the stage now where the most satisfying thing I do is to preach. Well, it may be that it's going to change. Be open to that. We'll see what happens. I think since you're pretty unique in your field, it would have to be very clear. But that comes to Jordan Peterson's second requirement. You must be able to see where the next opportunity is. And he saw that he had to take on the anti-free speech people at whatever cost, and he did it. And he's been rewarded because he slipped into a niche that he didn't know existed, and it was labeled for Jordan Peterson. That's tremendous. The next thing is a sense of the mainstream of life and work, what Shakespeare calls a tide in the affairs of men. You've got to know what's happening next. If anybody's doing science, for instance, as a career, I would say to PhD students, if they're Christian, you don't pray about the results of your experiments, but you certainly ought to pray about direction as to which experiments you do. To do the right experiment at the right time is key. Many people did the same thing as somebody who made a big name. They just did it at a different time without knowing really what they were doing and seeing where it went. That's important to know that can happen and therefore to be looking for it. He then, of course, being Jewish, puts a strong family ethic afterwards. Commitment to family is important. It used to be God first, family second. Others next and yourself last. That was a good, simple basis for ordering your life. But that required is number 5, which is a sense of community. I like Bloom's definition of community. A community is something that divides high and low into a common story of meaning. I grew up with that in a working class environment without knowing about it. It made all sorts of things totally predictable. There was no divorce. We didn't lock our doors because there was no theft. Differences between people occurred, and they were settled not by some fancy ethical argument, but by coming to terms with what is reasonable in our society, and was I being unreasonable? They didn't even ask the question that way. But when you look back on what they were doing, that's what they were doing. You say, we've got to get on. That's obvious. Sorry, let's carry on. Have a beer, whatever. The next one on his list, living in big cities, was a capacity to engage with diverse groups. There was little opportunity to do that in working class Birmingham growing up, but in the church there was. We were always having missionaries coming to our church, and my mother loved to look after Sunday tea for them. That's the first place I met a black missionary, because there was little immigration at that stage. That didn't happen till a little later. I was intrigued. I still remember him. I don't know what happened to him. My mother had the capacity to engage with people like that, and my father was always there backing her up. The next one is an ethic of benevolence. That was around all the while. People took care of one another. I mean, we had a lady close by, 3 houses down the road, who had MS, and her husband got her up in the morning and put her in a chair in the kitchen and went off for a day's work. But she was perfectly content. She didn't fear at all. And the women in the area, who weren't even allowed to work in those days, except in part-time jobs, dropped in and out all day, and so did the postman and the baker and the milkman and the rent man. That's the way it was. So people cared for one another. Politicians can't make you care for one another, but inhabiting a common story produces it. A work ethic is number 8, and a sense of discipline, number 9. The two, of course, go together, one more narrow than the other. But the idea that's now current amongst quite a lot of young people, that you can live off the government, not realizing that means living off your neighbor as well, that was not around. To be unemployed was, well, not a good idea. Nothing to be proud of. And discipline, yeah. You didn't do indisciplined things, and if you did, there would be consequences. That structure that an objective idea of right and wrong gives to a child is incredibly important. So I was blessed to be wrongly diagnosed with rheumatic fever and taken off school for about 3 or 4 months, during which time it must have been grade 1, I'm not sure exactly. But when I went back to school, I could read, because my mother realized I could do this sort of thing. So she taught me to read, and I was away. And I love doing puzzles. Those two things are not unimportant. I mean, I love the beginning of the film about Turing, the guy who solved the Enigma code. And in his interview, he says to a rather snobby Marine officer that he loved doing puzzles, and he didn't speak German, at which point the very limited imagination of the boss didn't see that you could still crack a code to get at German without reading German, which of course he did. He had an incredible work ethic and an incredible self-discipline at that level. That capacity, which is number 10, to focus and concentrate one's effort, is also important. When you get a lot of work done without even thinking about it very much. There are periods like that. Usually they fade away by the time you're 40. In most people's case, you go down to somewhat more predictable. But the amount of work you can get through in some places, you look back and you say, I don't know how I did that. Well, that's the way God made us. But it needs to be imprinted on you. And the capacity to concentrate is something which has got lost. I could go to the library when I was a student and not notice the time for 5 hours. Now, all the data from the study of students and phones shows that most students can't go without looking at their phone for minutes, certainly not hours. It's very disruptive. And so concentrated thought on one issue is necessary to make progress. And we're losing that. We're not as creative as we used to be. And you'd look at the great period, say, from, well, I usually use the same sequence: Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Boyle, Clerk, Maxwell, Faraday, Clerk, Maxwell, Eddington. I missed out Kepler, didn't I? Which is very bad. But that group of people did amazing work, entirely original. Newton wrote a single textbook that will never be matched. Kepler wrote prayers in his lab book and had an incredibly difficult life. But look at what they did. Faraday had no serious education, but look at what he did. What drove them? All those men were Christian. And all the men around them inhabited basically the Christian approach to all the big questions. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. I'll come back to this in a moment. So that means that you also can develop, number 11 on the list, a capacity to resist the lure of pleasure of hedonism, and a capacity for self-education, number 13. And number 14, an appreciation of quality in every respect, quality of scientific work, of any work, and wanting to do things well yourself. And finally, a little self-esteem. You need some, but not much. These other things, of course, will give you a very particular sort of self-esteem, that you realize that you have done things that you couldn't be expected to do, but you didn't. You're not really responsible for that. There is in this world something beyond ourselves, and it interacts with us. It's fascinating to see the steady return to faith of many scholars over the last little while. You see, look, we've been and done all this postmodern stuff and this woke stuff, and it's not producing anything that's worth having in a permanent sense. So even Neil Ferguson has gone back to church. He says, he's a sort of Christian now. I hope it becomes more. I realized he was heading in that direction, as I did with Jordan Peterson too, many years ago, because of throwaway lines which indicated that there was a chink in the secular armor. It can't answer the big questions. So, how does the Sermon on the Mount go on? What does our Lord do, having actually nailed us to the ground in terms of setting standards we can't reach? Now he goes on to talk about what we need to do. If we've come to a realization that there is something beyond ourselves, and that's something we might as well call God, and the story of Christ is essentially true, unlike Islam, which didn't write anything down for 200 years, all the gospel writers were first-hand accounts, or people who spoke to people. Luke, for instance, I mean, he was interacting with the disciples and with John Mark and others. They all were related, been there, seen that, or spoken to first-hand experience. And it's essentially true. You can't explain the incredible willingness of Christians to die for the faith, and the fact that they changed the world. They spread over the whole of the Mediterranean, not as the Muslims did by military prowess, but by love. Behold how these Christians love one another, was what happened. And how does that develop? This is not love as a feeling. That's the first thing, not as a feeling we generate. Paul calls it in Colossians, love in the Spirit. The fact that because Jesus promised the Spirit would come to us, and we find ourselves doing things or saying things which are loving in a much deeper sense than we could account for. We are privileged to be part of it, not to generate it. So love in the spirit happens contra what's going on around us, where human love comes about as an emotional, felt thing by interactions which are going backwards and forwards in a shared fashion. But Mother Teresa would be the classic example. She picked up people dying on the streets of Calcutta and loved them. Not emotionally. I mean, yes, her emotions are all in the right place, but she would have said, this is a gift from God, that she was allowed to do this. And that's what happens all the while. And I grew up hearing those stories like George Muller, for instance. If you've never heard the story of George Muller, go and find a biography. Faith in action. I saw it and knew it and could recognize it. So the next chapter, chapter 6, is about how you practice your faith. He's going to go through how you give, how you pray, very important, how you deal with things, how you develop a Christian mind, and how you learn to trust, all through the development of the means of grace in one way or another. The first one he takes straight away is giving. And as usual, he really turns upside down your ideas. He says, when you give, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, or the other way around. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Do it in secret. Because if you do it in public for general approbation, that's virtue signaling. You had all the reward you're going to get. But when you do it in secret, your Father in heaven knows, and he will reward openly what was done in secret, not by making anything good of you, because his rewards are not the rewards of power, prestige, and pleasure in the usual sense, but of companionship, discipleship, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, faithfulness. Against such there is no law. Those are the things that are the rewards. They're not ours by right, but they can be by gift. You can get at this very easily with one question with any of your family or the people you work with. How many people do you trust and why? Now, it's got nothing to do with education. I'll tell you that as a gift. Just check that I'm right. So, what is the nature of it? How does it come about? Trust. That's what Fogel said is missing. And he's writing in 2000, he says, the next 50 years are going to depend upon whether America can maintain levels of trust that really work. And of course, politics in particular is savage and awful in many respects. And what's going on at the moment appears to be showing that a lot of people were exploiting the system. We'll be cautious at drawing conclusions. We need a little while, but I certainly know from first hand that the UN is corrupt. You only have to be in a refugee camp and realize, talking even to the people who work there, who say, well, you have to leave when the cynicism gets too bad. That's really sad, but true. We've seen it. Politics, power, money, where they shouldn't be. So, where do we go from there? Read chapter 6, but he's going to show you how to change the pattern of your whole life. But start with giving. Interestingly, Janet Smith, whom I greatly admire, gives the best talk I know on how to have a successful marriage called Contraception Why Not, which you can find online. But the first step, she says, is when you marry, sit down together every year with your spouse and give away 10% of what you have received yourself to those less well off than you, and do it together. One of you will be more materialistic than the other, and you will both be better for the experience. She has 3 more steps to take as well, but that's not today's talk. Now, what we're seeing, without any question, is a collapse of culture. It's often pervaded, what's the word I want? Presented, sorry, as though it's a question of race. No, it's not. Don't talk about race, because the moment you talk about race, you become a racist. I mean, if you start painting yourself as a racial victim, you're going to be racist towards the people you say were the victimizers. You've got to talk about more objective things than that. And the thing to talk about is culture. Now, this week, I listened to Douglas Murray talking at the ARC conference in London, ARC. You can find it on YouTube. And he gives a really superb talk on why culture is the thing that matters. And we shouldn't be directed away from it by any other trivial that's here today and gone tomorrow, like all the woke nonsense. Most heresy, most getting wrong of understanding, as Lewis put it, is good things in wrong places. And those who lead us at the moment don't even have an idea of what the hierarchy might contain. But there's absolutely no question, culturally, what mattered most was truth. Now, many of my colleagues in the universities sort of arrogantly say, oh, what is truth? They change their mind when they're passed over for promotion because of the wrong color or the wrong disability or the wrong gender. That then they want justice. Justice has to be based on truth. We can't get away from it. But when we allow, as we have done, identity politics to lead the way without any discussion of where that should go and how that's going to work out, we're in deep trouble. Douglas Murray, who's an unbelieving, but what's the word I want? He's almost longing for faith, I think, homosexual. But he is brilliant, and he was in Gaza within a day or two of October the 7th. He goes into the world's worst places to see what's actually happening. And over the years, watching him, he's honest, and he's written a series of superb books. But go listen to that ARC conferences, Douglas Murray. You can find it on YouTube. Maybe there'll be some correspondence and I can talk some more about it. But I want to move on to one other person before the big one on Tom Sowell. You will also find at that same conference, Os Guinness is speaking, and he also does a superb talk from a more Christian point of view. I first came across him when I was a student, and he wrote a book called The Dust of Destiny, and I hadn't read anything else like it, and I followed him since. He also wrote a lovely book, if you wanted for a reading group. He took C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters and rejigged it into, now what on earth is the title of the book? It's gone from me in a moment. Os Guinness. Oh, The Gravedigger File. And what he does is he imagines an enemy agent, i.e. from the devil, not from the communists, who is in charge of strategies for Europe, Russia, America after the Second World War. And he decides that in Europe we'll have an intellectual attack on Christianity, setting out to prove it's all rubbish and not true. Suitable for women and children would be the nasty way they would express it. And it very nearly succeeded. But it didn't, because those that were brought through that process, in the process, learned how to argue their case. So it's not an accident that Os Guinness himself, coming through that process, turned out to be a very good apologist for the Christian faith. And in that book, he describes the way the intellectual attack on Christianity almost worked, but then failed. So you end up with people like Bonhoeffer, John Legnitz these days, John Stott, N.T. Wright. You can go on. They learned their job, C.S. Lewis par excellence, of course, by opposing seriously in intellectual terms this attack on faith. Now, in America, in North America, the plan was entirely different. The other plan was to turn the church into a social club where nothing of importance was discussed. And that has nearly succeeded. Even a couple of my children were upset when I said publicly that pornography was a major problem for our young people and we needed to do something about it. We don't talk about those things in front of the children. Well, if you don't talk about them in front of them when they see them, which they will, because most children now, by the age of 12, have seen pornography without it being called that. And if you haven't already primed them with the fact that the world is like this in an appropriate way so that they can talk about it, you're foolish. I was pushed into this because I was in Jamaica earlier this year. The last thing I did on the way back, a gentleman who had a real sense of how young men with no active fathers needed help, and he was running a program in the poorest, most dangerous bit of Kingston for 30 or so young men, teaching them some basic skills in things like being an electrician, a plumber, or an air conditioning guy. And he said, would you come and talk to them? And I said, I don't talk about... No, he said, I want you to talk about the way you talk to medical students. They're not stupid. So I did. And they were extremely attentive. And at the end of it, I was talking to a bunch of them. And I don't know where it sprang from, but I said, how many of this group watch pornography? And the answer was instant. All of them. All of us. And it's addictive. And it destroys your ability to treat a woman as you should. That really upset me. It's a huge business, and you see its pressures everywhere. Now, we've got to push back somehow. I'm not the one to do that, but at least I could wave a red flag. So, that situation is ongoing. Screens have got a lot to do with it, and I've already talked about Jonathan Haidt's important work on this issue. But how did these things come about in the way they did? And the person I find that I've been reading this week who helps me a lot after asking is Tom Sowell. I restocked myself. Good books vanish, and one must have a high view of the sovereignty of God. And I got a new copy of Basic Economics, which, of course, made me read it again. And I've got to look. Oh, my goodness, time flies. I just want to send you out to buy your own copy, because I think in the modern world, where we have got to be more politically active, we've got to have some sensible understanding of economics. And Tom Sowell has written a book on economics without a single equation in it. He wants it to communicate with ordinary people. He himself grew up initially he was born in the Carolinas, and then his parents died, and he ended up being educated in New York when public education was still good enough. His biography is amazing, and if you want to read it, you probably will after reading his book on economics. But he makes you think your way through things. He said, the people who run the government are very enamored of their own ideas. He calls this the anointed, self-anointed. But their ideas, they're only concerned that they sell politically. They don't actually work out what what the consequences are going to be. Consequences are not something they want to think about. And he's very good at injecting every now and again a little narrative which makes a point in a way that pages of ordinary prose won't do. And here on page 17 of the book, right near the beginning, he's talking about how during the era of government-directed economy of the Soviet Union, for example, prices were not set by supply and demand, but by central planners who sent resources to their various uses by direct commands, supplemented by prices that planners raised or lowered as they saw fit. The anointed. Two Soviet economists, Shamilev and Popov, described the situation in which their government raised the price it would pay for moleskins, leading hunters to go get and sell more of them. State purchases, he writes, increased, and now, this is Shamilev and Popov, now all the distribution centres are filled with these pelts. Industry is unable to use them all, and they often rot in the warehouse before they can be processed. Sorry, I must deal with that phone before. Oh, it's gone. That's good. Before they could be processed, so I hope that can be edited out. I'm sure it will be. The Ministry of Light Industry had already requested Goudge twice to lower the purchasing prices, but the question had not yet been decided. And this is not surprising. Its members are too busy to decide. They have no time. Besides setting prices on these pelts, they have to keep track of another 24 million prices. Central planning can't do details. When Gorbachev came to England for the first time, and he said to Mrs. Thatcher, how do you make sure that these people are fed? Because England can't feed itself. It doesn't have enough land. And she said, we don't do anything. The market does it. That, I think, was probably a turning point for Gorbachev and what he was allowed to do subsequently. It's an astonishing story, isn't it? He goes on to take you through how to think about these things. And I remember when I went to university, I thought rent control was reasonable because poor people were living from check to check or pay packet to pay packet. They never had checks. Any increase in rent would be disastrous. The economy was that tight for them. But of course, Tom Sowell says, well, show me the data. And there are multiple examples of what happened. And many of them, the best, clearest ones, happened in the 60s when Britain shed its empire, especially in Africa. I'll just read a paragraph. When many African colonies achieved national independence in the 1960s, a famous bet was made between the president of Ghana and the president of the neighbouring Ivory Coast, Nkrumah, a doctrinaire Marxist, as to which country would become the more prosperous in the years ahead. At that time, Ghana was not only more prosperous than Ivory Coast, it had more natural resources, so the bet might have seemed reckless on the part of the president of Ivory Coast. However, he knew that Ghana committed to a government-run economy and the Ivory Coast to a freer market. By 1982, the Ivory Coast had so surpassed Ghana economically that the poorest 20% of its people had a higher real income per capita than most of the people in Ghana. This could not be attributed to any superiority of the country or its people. In fact, in later years, when the Ivory Coast eventually succumbed to the temptation to control more of its country's economy, while Ghana finally learned from its mistakes and began to loosen government controls on the market, the two countries' roles reversed. And now Ghana's economy began to grow, while that of the Ivory Coast declined. Ghana is also unique in another sense. They actually asked their last Governor-General to come back, and he did, and they loved him. It's a wonderful story. You go find it for yourself. Housing is the same way. If you try to control it, it's too big. But when you let the market do it, you've got the back and forth of everyone else. Tom Sowell comes with a very nice example. He writes this. He's talking about America on this case. What happened after the Second World War is that they had people came back after the war, and the housing situation had not changed, but people had changed, so that what had previously been enough housing was now not enough housing because a lot of people had got used to the idea that they wanted a bigger house, whereas before the war they were sharing that house a lot longer. So the same amount of housing was now inadequate, and they thought that rent controls would be the way to do it. But it actually made it worse, because when you control rents, then people stop fixing up buildings and they don't build new ones, but the population grows. If you want, and when the government tries to build houses, that's even more of a disaster. But once you let the market take over, of course, rents can't go up very much, because if people don't have money, they can't pay the rent. So people are ingenious. They find ways around it. So people who before the war had a relative living with them tended to have one again. So the same space provided for more people when there weren't rent controls. But once rent controls came in, that had diminished the maneuverability of ordinary people. And some of those rent controls have gone on forever. Here's how it's got to. New York being one of the worst places that still has them. Les Katz, a 27-year-old acting student at Dorman, rents a small studio apartment in Manhattan's Upper West Side for $1,200 with two roommates. Two sleep in separate beds in a loft built atop the kitchen, the third on a mattress in the main room. Across town on Park Avenue, Paul Haberman, a private investor, and his wife live in a spacious two-bedroom apartment with a solarium and two terraces. The apartment, in an elegant building on the prestigious avenue, is worth at least $5,000 a month. Real estate professionals say the couple pay around $350, according to rent records. And there are people who have got rent-controlled places in New York, which they don't use more than a few days a year because they're rich enough to afford it, but it's nice to have somewhere in New York at prices that go back decades. The idea that bureaucrats could know enough, they're not malicious, the problem is too big. Just as Popov and his mate could say, they had to set the prices for 24 million items. I mean, Russia was rich in terms of resources. Lots of oil, lots of everything, but they couldn't manage it. They went on to say, look, we spend 1,000 kilowatt hours of energy to do what the Germans do with 300 at that time. Because when you control things, people don't have any incentive to make it work better. Incentive matters. Tom Sowell's basic rule is that you can teach your children, whenever you're looking at a public policy, you need to ask three questions. You need to ask, what's the current one? What do we know about it? Compare it to what you're going to do. Number two, what can you imagine might happen that could be disastrous? That gives you another chance to escape. And then three, before you do anything, show me some data, do an experiment. That would have solved many of these problems. But those that have the levers of power are not, unfortunately, our brightest and best. And more importantly, their ethics are not what they should be. And as I've said before, and will say again at some stage, I'm sure, ethics lectures won't solve the problem. Ethics lectures may make you into an amateur ethicist, but they don't make you good. living the narrative of the Bible with Jesus as the teacher will make you good. He'll get to you. Have a good week.